On behalf of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, both online and there at the Walnut Hills Branch Library. My name is Christina Hartlieb. I'm the Executive Director at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, and I'm not at the library tonight, but I'm coming to you from my very own dining room. I know it looks exciting, doesn't it? But we have a fun-filled evening. I think, well, the topic's not fun-filled, but we're going to have a lively discussion and some great collaboration and discussion about this particular topic, which is early Black abolitionists. So let me do a couple of other quick announcements, and that is that I want to thank our sponsor for the Voices for Truth discussion series, which is School Outfitters. They do a lot of cool school and office type furniture. So if you want to learn more about their services, you can visit their website at schooloutfitters.com. I also want to thank our esteemed discussion leaders, Dr. John Getz and JeMiah Israel, who are here this evening to talk about what we need to discuss. And then I'm going to say these two announcements at both the beginning and the end, and that is, if you have not yet signed up for our Semicolon Club discussion later this month, it is a film about Paul Laurence Dunbar and then discussion to follow. And that will take place on February 24th at 2 p.m. there at the library in the downstairs auditorium. And you can go to our website, see the upcoming events, and click on that to get your tickets for that. That goes through our new ticket registration system that we're using. And then also, I do need to announce that next month's discussion will actually take place online and in the tavern at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. We're going to have a special sneak peek look at the restoration stuff. And so we're going to conduct the discussion group there in the tavern for the month of March. So I just wanted to make that little note so that you're like, okay, don't go to the library next month, go to the house. And again, that will be on all of the marketing stuff, but also we'll say it at the end here. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Getz, who likes to start with a timeline. So if you are ready, John?
Yep. Thank you, Chris. Let's get started. I think Chris is going to put the timeline up, probably on screen, but anybody here would have it in front of you. You picked it up. The backdrop for this timeline is the dramatically increasing Atlantic slave trade at the time we're talking about here, the life of Equiano. In the 1730s, the decade before he was born, about 52,000 enslaved Africans were brought across the Atlantic, primarily to serve, to be enslaved in the West Indies. Some came to the American colonies too. And that will grow as the decades go by. So I have learned, I think, to pronounce the first name of Equiano correctly. What I've read, it's Olaudah Equiano. He was born he says, in Aseke, Nigeria, according to his narrative. Now, if you've looked into this very much at all, you know that there was a dispute about whether he was really born in Africa or born in the West Indies, born in the Carolinas, and we'll talk about that. But wherever it was, he was born about 1745, and then he arrived in Virginia, kidnapped from Africa or from wherever, enslaved, and is purchased by Michael Henry Pascal, who will name him Gustavus Vassa. Where did he get that name? Well, some of you might know that Gustavus Vassa is considered the sort of George Washington of Sweden. He led the Swedes in their fight for independence from Denmark, from a coalition of governments there. And this was hundreds of years before, back in the 1500s. And he also was credited with bringing the Protestant Reformation to Sweden as well. He became the first king, really solidified the country as a country. Now, do we really believe that Pascal was some ardent student of Swedish history? Probably not. But there was a play based on the life of Gustavus Vassa that was playing around this time in Ireland. It had a brief turn in England, but since it was portraying Gustavus Vassa as the patriot who liberated his people from an oppressive people, some of the British government, Sir Robert Walpole, were not very happy with this. And they banned the play. But it went to Ireland, which was where the playwright was from anyway, and it had quite a run there, and eventually made its way back to England. So it's possible that Pascal heard of the play, maybe saw the play. That's most likely the explanation for where the name comes from, why he chose to give it to this enslaved African boy. We don't know. Was it a prank? Was he trying to have a joke at the kid's expense, or was he really seriously saw some leadership qualities in this kid that, as it turned out, he would have been right. He became an incredibly gifted leader in the fight against slavery. So anyway, he takes the name, and he eventually, though he resisted the name at first, he embraces the name over time and insists on being called by that name, signs his name that way. In the narrative he will write of his book, he uses his African name, but then he also puts Gustavus Vassa there as well. So he's using both names, but in his personal correspondence or dealings with people, he went by Gustavus Vassa as an adult, and that was his British identity. So he served in the British Navy, found his way to England, was baptized in 1759 into the Church of England. He then worked for Robert King, who was a Quaker slave trader. Any hear any factors in that, but many Quakers were quite active in the slave trade, unfortunately. So for the next 3 years, he worked for him in Montserrat, a British colony in the Caribbean. He was a sailor and himself a trader between the West Indies and the American colonies. He would get buy goods and sell them at a profit. So he was becoming quite the merchant, successful merchant. Okay, we're in the 1760s now. By this time, 64,000 Africans are being brought over to the New World. Think of a big triangle. It starts in England. Here we are. It starts in England, crosses over, or goes to the west coast of Africa, acquires slaves there, and then takes them to the Western Hemisphere, primarily the West Indies, but to some extent in the British colonies as well. And while doing that in the colonies, is acquiring rice, sugar primarily, and some cotton to take back to England, as well as profits that go back there as well from the slave trade. So it's growing in the 60s, growing in the 70s. Equiano has amassed enough money to buy his freedom by 1766. He does some other sailing expeditions, one to the Arctic, looking for a northeast passage over Europe and Asia. Didn't work out. And then he was admitted to communion in the Westminster Church, the Church of England, in 1775. He made one final voyage to the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua with Dr. Charles Irving, who wanted to establish a plantation there, but he wasn't very comfortable with that anymore. He left Nicaragua for London and arrived in 1776, where he starts to become involved in the abolitionist cause. He's the one who sort of wrote the story about the Zong massacre that's described here. There were navigation errors on the slave ship Zong coming over on the Middle Passage. Drinking water ran low because they got off course. And so they took 132 enslaved people and threw them overboard to drown. So the owners could collect insurance on them. Terrible scandal. Equiano, by notifying abolitionist Granville Sharp about that, brought it to public attention. It was a big scandal, got tied up in the courts. It wasn't as easy for the owners to claim their money as they thought it was going to be. He works for the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor on an expedition to Sierra Leone, the newly established, the colony getting established by the British to repatriate Black people from England. Basically, I mean, it was partly for formerly enslaved people, but it was also an effort by the British to clear out a Black population in London too, and try to move them somewhere else. After exposing mismanagement of the expedition, he gets fired, and then goes full steam into abolition. It's the 1780s by now. By this time, the slave trade is at its peak, the Atlantic slave trade, and the British are in charge of it. It is the primary engine of the British economy in the 1700s. 90,000 Africans per year in the 1780s are transported to the colonies, again, primarily to the West Indies, but also to the American colonies. So you, with the Sons of Africa, former Africans living in London, they form this abolitionist group. He becomes a leading speaker. He's responding in a public letter in the London Advertiser to a pro-slavery treatise that came out defending slavery in the West Indies. It really wasn't that bad. Well, he saw it. Equiano did, and he said, yes, it was that bad. And he even presented an anti-slavery petition to Britain's Queen Charlotte. And then 1789, I think we have it as 98 in the blurb, but online, but it's 89, he publishes his narrative. And the pressure from the abolitionists is growing. Parliament caves a bit, deciding to regulate the slave trade, but stops short of abolishing it. The book sells very well. He becomes kind of a celebrity. It's popular in the colonies. In 1791, it's published in New York. And he eventually marries, goes through 9 editions in his lifetime. And here's where our two people tonight overlap just a little bit in the 1790s. Equiano will die in 1797 of natural causes. The year before that, David Walker is born. He's born as a free person in Wilmington, North Carolina. He's free because his mother, although Black, is free. So that the freedom was transmitted through her. His father was an enslaved man, but he died before David's birth. So Equiano dies. Now Walker takes center stage for us. And by the way, the Atlantic slave trade continues even after Britain outlaws it in 1807. Other countries were going ahead with it. About 54,000 Africans were transported in the 18 teens, 65,000 in the next decade, 55,000 in the 1830s. So this kept going. It didn't stop. The Denmark, Walker moves to Charleston, South Carolina, where he joins the new African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first Black denomination in the U.S. This is a militant black church arguing against slavery, very unpopular with the white citizens of Charleston, of course. And Denmark Vesey's slave conspiracy is thwarted in 1822. Some people speculate that maybe Walker was involved in some way in that, but no tie between him and the conspiracy has been conclusively established. I think this is
What that was?
it was even Denmark Vesey was a member of that church. And he had quite a well-organized plot to basically rise up for the enslaved people, to rise up against the whites in Charleston. Somebody ratted him out, and so they were all caught before anything happened, and many of them, including Vesey, were killed, were executed for this. But it sent shockwaves throughout the South, throughout white Southerners. Scared because in many cases they were outnumbered by the slaves, by the enslaved people. Okay, so he settles in Boston in 1825, Walker does, marries a local woman, and is initiated into Prince Hall, the African Masonic Lodge number 459, an activist group, and there's also a Black Methodist church there that he joins with another anti-slavery minister, Samuel Snowden. So you can see, we talk about the abolitionist movement, and a lot of times we make it sound like it starts with William Lloyd Garrison, but this is before William Lloyd Garrison. And in fact, reading Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world seems to have converted Garrison himself from his former colonizationist position to abolition. So it's important to see the Black roots of abolition, not just the white participants. Let's see. He becomes one of the founders of the Massachusetts General Colored Association, MGCA, not MAGA, which has been called the first avowedly Black political organization in America. He's involved with the first Black newspaper, and then he writes his appeal. The interesting thing about the appeal, or one of many interesting things, is that he uses clandestine networks of communications among enslaved and free Southern Blacks to circulate the pamphlet there. This was aimed at Black people in the North and particularly in the South.
They had to be literate.
Pardon?
They had to be literate.
Had to be literate.
Yes, and his hope was that those who were would read it to those who were not. So that, yes, you had literate to read it, but there were little groups of people meeting secretly where someone who could read, usually a free Black, would read to the other people who were there. Naturally, the slaveholders went crazy about this, and it was banned. People were arrested, prosecuted for possessing this text. It was a hot potato. But it went through 3 editions in his lifetime. Unfortunately, he died quite young of tuberculosis in 1830. He was so hated by white Southerners that some people speculated he was poisoned, but there's never been any evidence convincing advanced for that. And sadly, also buried in an unmarked grave in the section of South Boston Cemetery reserved for Blacks. And his property was lost. His wife did not have the money to continue payments on the house, so it was foreclosed, and exactly what he had warned against in his appeal. Nat Turner's rebellion follows the next year, and slaveholders blame Walker's appeal for that. Even the abolitionist movement in the 1830s backs away from him. They thought it was maybe a little too up front, a little too out there. And he was called a fanatic, fomenting revolution. He was accused of things. Remember that Garrison was very nonviolent in his approach. He was he was ambivalent about Walker, even though he agreed to move away from colonization, but he was still ambivalent about some of the things in the text. And then finally, Henry Highland Garnett, a militant abolitionist in 1848, republishes Walker's appeal with a brief biography and a speech of his own. And by that time, the abolitionist movement was getting so fed up with their lack of success that Walker kind of returns to some prominence through Garnett. Although even he was a very controversial figure. Everybody was on board with some of the positions that he took. So I think it's important to see the abolitionist movement is not monolithic either. There are all sorts of opinions within that. Well, I've been talking about. Let's turn it over to JeMiah to ask the first question of the discussion.
Thanks, John. So
I'm gonna interrupt for just a second. Sorry. So we have a lot of people here, and so I just want to kind of go over a couple of pointers, ground rules, that kind of thing. And so I'm going to pop the questions onto the screen for just a minute because most people have received them if you're online, but I want to just pop them on the screen for just a second. And if you don't have one handy, take a picture because I want to leave it up for people to see each other for the majority of the time. So I'm just gonna, all right. There we go. There's all the questions. So like I said, if you don't have them handy, just take a quick picture. And then as we get ready to do our discussion, you know, we have a lot of people online and a lot of people in-house. So I'm going to kind of defer to Marty to call on people in-house if necessary. And if you're online and you would like to speak up, that's not a problem. Just raise your virtual hand and we'll get to your questions and comments as well. So I just wanted to kind of use that as a little bit of ground rules because otherwise it will be very chaotic as we try to discuss these important things to discuss. So now that we've got that done, I'm going to step back and let JeMiah do her thing.
Thanks, Christina. So our opening question goes back to what John mentioned about Equiano and the discrepancy of his birthplace. So Equiano's claim to have been born in Africa was disputed in his own time and is still questioned in practice. So what effect, if any, did this questioning have on your reaction to the readings and the first two chapters of the narrative?
It didn't make any difference to me, but I was surprised to find that out tonight because reading his whatever that thing was called, reading his work, it sounded to me like he totally was born there. Otherwise, where did he get all that detail? I you know, could have heard it from other people who read it in other books, but it didn't change my view of what he wrote. Does it? Should it? Is that the wrong answer?
Well, I agree with you. Even if parts of it are fictionalized, it's still a solid message.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing, back on the other two speakers. If he didn't come from Africa, where did he come from at that period of time? Right? Could have already been here in the Americas, I mean, the US, what?
West Indies. Some of
West
the
Indies.
that he was born in the Carolinas.
Mm.
I think, like someone else mentioned, even if he wasn't born in Africa, when we think about how rare it was for someone to be able to read and write, you know, even if these were the stories of other enslaved people, like there's a place for that as well. Like these stories, these people that did come from Africa, it could have been a way for their story to be told, for their memories to be presented. But I agree with you, like, does it really matter and does it change the facts that we can prove? It wasn't abnormal for enslaved people not to be able to trace their roots back to where they were. So I don't find that there's undisputable claims to dispute his birthplace. But I don't think that they were.
I just thought that it's going to be an authentic voice. He wanted his voice to be authentic, be accepted as a voice of authority that on the subject that he was speaking. And so for him to come from Africa would probably give him a little more credence, perhaps. But I think I agree more with your point of view, or the one you at least articulated, that it doesn't really matter. He came from Africa, or his ancestors did. You know, people of color from the African diaspora come from Africa. And so I think that was his point, that this is a voice that represents multiple people. That Africa is not a country or a city, it's a continent, and it's broad. And so he wanted to represent the broad spectrum of people of color from that particular background. And so he just gave authenticity to what he was saying.
Right. Go ahead. Can I interject for a second? I think another big component of that really is that he goes into so much detail, and he really talks about all of the people and places in Africa, and he really humanizes the people that live there. And so whether he actually was born there or not, I don't care. It's more of a, hey, this is a whole culture and civilization and people and a great diversity of people here in Africa, is what he's saying. And so I think that overall leads credence to his overall points of why would you treat people differently, because we have this civilization too.
Excellent.
I may be getting ahead.
You are.
And I think it gives a completely different narrative of what people were being told about African people or Black and brown people at the time. He makes sure to highlight, that they were clean people, that they did have moral laws and follow moral principles. So it just sort of gave quite the opposite perspective than the barbaric people that, the way that they were looked at during that time as well.
I just want to underscore, that's an excellent point. He humanized the African in the Americas. And that was an achievement, because we know that slavery was justified on the principle that Africans were savages, as Native Americans and other people. And he humanized the African, or anyone from the African diaspora, as being humans with feelings and culture. The big factor and some of the arguments for slavery was there was no culture in Africa, there was no civilizations, there was no governments, there was no history, and that is certainly untrue. And so he helped to scatter that myth.
It was especially important, I think, that he points out things that are parallel to European civilization in order to be better accepted, so to speak, not necessarily, it's not, okay, he talks about the elders, for example, in their stance in the community. He talks about the relationship in the family, the master of the family, and then the family members around them. He talks about morality, which you mentioned, and the commonalities of that. Knowing that by the time he writes this, he already is plugged into a church, and he knows what the AME church is saying and what the sentiment is for religion, so to speak, and for culture and for morality. All of those things are baked into that first chapter to help make everything he says more acceptable to a broader audience. And I think he does a great job of doing that. Very effective.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Okay, so I don't like read the actual narrative, I'm just trying to get it on a limb. But
That's okay.
I'm trying to understand, like, even the basis of like a reason to discredit what he said is in the background, if that makes sense, like why even question what he's saying is his roots, if it's not to, you know, again, like dehumanize him, or what he says is like, you know, his existence. I'm trying to like understand, I mean, because I read it, so I'm kind of like thinking, I'm trying to understand, like, it says a lot in that, you know, like the questioning, I mean, like, if it's what he's saying his identity is, then the fact that you're questioning it, I mean, it's just, honestly, it correlates within the same narrative of trying to dehumanize a person or like take away the value he's trying to give to himself, you know, by saying these are his roots, like,
Right.
you're questioning the person saying, I just.
When did the question come up? When did the
When
question of his birthplace come up? I mean, did it come up at the time? Or is this something that has come up by historians?
We have in our own time, we have the birth of rule.
Oh, absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the birth of thing is to discredit the person's origin.
Absolutely.
And, trying to downgrade a person. His description in the first two chapters, I just can't think of it. The description there, and you said, it's a human act. The concept of abolition is to say, hey, I'm a man. And I can't be owned by another person, I'm a man. Right. And equal to me. And so he establishes equality by saying, I'm voluntary, that's equal to this.
Right.
It's different. It's still different, but still equal.
Yeah.
I'm a man and I'm a human man. You know,
That's right.
That was the big deal. That I'm not 3/4 of a man, I'm not a savage, I'm not a beast in the jungle, you know, so that you are doing me a favor, you know, so, you know, there was this philosophy by some slave owners that they were doing the African a favor. Right, bringing them out of the jungle.
Absolutely. We read some of those last year.
But you're right. I'm a man, I'm a Christian now.
I can't hear the conversation in the room very well at the moment. It kind of goes in and out a little bit, but Shelley online has a question or comment. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, I just want to put the question of authenticity in a little context, because of course 1889 was the same year that Benjamin Franklin published his autobiography. And while historians have, there is some general agreement among historians that not all of the facts in Benjamin Franklin's own autobiography are actually accurate or true. And yet there's a general recognition that sort of with him, it doesn't matter, you know, so it doesn't, you know, it's, and then, while on the other hand, the poet Jupiter Hammond, who published poems in 1773, needed a white person to write an introduction for his poems in order to prove that they were, quote, authentic and the real work of an African-American man. So this sense, what other people have been saying about this sense of like anything to discredit Equiano would, you know, it's just a really interesting how it cuts historically across racial lines.
I just think when you take away identity, like that's when, you know, the power, like the mental power, like when you strip somebody of their identity, that's where people know that point of like of power or taking over, you know, their mental, that like taking over their mental is where they'll have that control. So like even debating where he's coming from, I think that's where that was the point of entry they tried to take, and just in terms of like, you know, enslaved people in general, taking away any sense of, you know, an origin to gain that mental power. I mean,
Right.
Usually the avenue, it still is.
Right.
Excellent point.
Right.
Very insightful.
The other thing is to justify the cruel institution. You have to make yourself a better person. You have to have some kind of rational justification. If this is a group like a monkey or a dog, you're helping. And if it's a man, then what kind of man is to do this to another man?
It's like internal cycle.
And so a significant amount of the justification is the exaggeration thing. And contrary, the way he's written his book, relates to that, what's happening inside the casket.
Excellent.
Move on to the second question.
Yeah.
I'll ask that one. Why do you think that he devote, and we've already answered some of this already, so we may be able to cover this one pretty fast. Why do you think Equiano devotes the entire first chapter to a detailed description of the African culture he claims to have been born into?
I think there's like a Bob Marley quote, I can't quite remember it, but it's like, when you know your history, you know who you are, and it's kind of what she was saying, like they took away our sense of identity, our history, our culture, and like claimed that where we came from was less than what we were. So I feel like he went over that to try to give us back that sense of identity.
Right, and just to add on to what you said, also, I think when you write things down, it's like a power in writing these things down, even for himself, like to devote a whole chapter to something that maybe other people were trying to strip from him, even in that moment, in that time, like writing it down made it more tangible or more real for him, like giving a whole chapter, being intentional with like how much he was giving to that chapter, maybe.
Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
think that in addition, I do agree with that. In addition to that, I think he was not writing it just for himself. He was writing for so many others who did not have access to their own background. Think about it. This is 100 years or more after slavery. You know, if we look at the 1619 bill. So there were so many subsequent generations that did not have access to the African culture at all. And I remember maybe in the 60s or 70s, I think Bill Cosby did a program called Culture Lost, Stolen, or Strayed. It was a documentary on TV that was really popular quite a long time ago, but it's because the essence of our dehumanization was founded in the belief, the false belief, that there was no culture from the African community. And I think that, for me, is what he was saying. There is culture. They never heard about Ghana, Songhai, and Mali. African kingdoms long before, you know, our history didn't start with slavery. And so I think that's what he's trying to get individuals to understand, that there is an African culture, and he had to force that issue because it was accepted by the majority in society. And it helped them to justify slavery. Whether they believed in it or not, it helped them, I think it helped them to justify it. Because how can, this gentleman said, how can a man justify enslaving another man? It's like, it doesn't make any sense. But when you say, well, this really isn't a man, they don't have culture, they're really not like us, then that gives you the justification to dehumanize even further another human being.
And all this all correlates back to the mental power, even like within themselves, like psyching themselves out to believe. You know, like seeing the evidence of like being over there and like being in the place where they're, you know, taking people from their homeland, like they saw, I'm sure they saw like the unity, they saw something, but like to psych themselves out, even again, mentally, to believe that like these people, you know, deserve to live in insane conditions or be treated the way they were. Like it's exactly what they.
I love what you said about, like, he didn't write it for himself, he wrote it for, because I think about the time that this was written and how more closely connected to their roots that they probably were then than we are now, 500 years ago. And I think he went into great detail, not just to say, you know, I'm of African descent, because even to use the term African already discredits, you know, so many different cultures and identities But he went into great detail about their cultural practices. That when people today start to do research or start to want to connect to who they are, there's some beauty there that, like she was saying, when you are stripped of your identity, it's really hard to, know who you are, it's really hard to feel empowered. And I think we can go back to not a location, but for me, it's the essence of the way that they live that resonates with me, and I think can help start to connect people back to their identity, back to the diaspora, back to what life was like for their ancestors, because I mean, especially for our youth today, it's hard to envision, a history that used to be ours, and we are, we buy into what we're told.
And one of the arguments defending slavery was, well, there's always been slavery. The Romans enslaved people, the Greeks enslaved people. How does he address that in here? Catch that?
Even in this discussion of the home country, there was slavery.
Yes.
The Europeans, I think, had wives, plural, and slaves. And so, I thought that was very interesting.
But I've always been taught the distinguishing factors between the North Atlantic, trans-slave trade and all other slave trades was the issue of humanity. That, yeah, Romans had slaves, but they were regarded as humans. Other countries had slaves, African countries had slaves, but they were never demoralized to being less than human. They were just human beings, it was part of their system, and they were allowed, many, not all, but they were allowed to marry. Even the Atlantic slave trade in South America, many countries allowed, like the example here, the mother was free and the father was enslaved, but the child was free, born free. Walker was born free. That system probably describes traditional slavery among Romans and other countries more so than the dehumanization of the individual.
Well, the bottom line is money. I think in this country, the issue of slavery was money.
Right.
And
the slave herself was not considered human.
Right, when they bought a person, they bought so much labor. And they got working man or woman to death. And later, the northern states, after slavery was abolished down, the northern states, like the southern states, bred slaves.
Right.
They bred, they built this transport back.
They had breeding farms.
But there was always some good guys. There's another thing, a couple of things I read about the good guys. When the Constitution of Ohio was written, there were about 30 people or so. And it wound up that white only could be citizens, and there were a lot of things that blacks had to do. But about a third, about 11 of those people were for full suffrage for black men. That fascinates me. The other thing is that about the good side, because they're not all bad, the good side was that the Abolitionist Society. You mentioned earlier about how they varied, and there were colonization people within abolition who wanted to move black folk out of this country into another. We started like that, like 1830 or so. But the Ohio Abolition Society broke with the National because they wanted full suffrage for black men. That's something just, so some proud part of it. There's a lot of bad stuff about slavery riots and things in Cincinnati, and all that, all the bigotry and slavery across the river. All that, there's a lot of bad stuff. I thought I mentioned those two things. But there have always been people, white people, who were from full citizens.
Right. Yeah, there was definitely a range within the anti-slavery movement, there was, we talk about it during our tour, that there's folks all the way over here and there's folks all the way over here. There's colonizationists and immediate emancipation over here, and a wide range of opinions in the middle there.
Today we have abortion rights.
Well, yeah, we've always got to have something to fight about, you know.
I think Dan online has a comment.
Yeah, I think the question has to do with how forceful he was. He directly said that the difference between slavery here in the United States and in other countries in past histories is that the United States has it enshrined in the Constitution that all men are equal. But more so, he says, we call ourselves a Christian country. And Christianity demands living up to Christ. And therefore, ours is the worst. Ours is the worst because we are not living up to our Christian heritage and to the freedom of all peoples. I think he's very forceful in saying that. It's the Christianity that we pretend to have that he makes a big point of that. Thank you.
I know what jumps out. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What jumps out to me is the word slavery and that other communities or what have you had slaves, but they were more. I want to use the term that I read about, indentured servants, where you were, you committed a crime and then you had to provide service to a particular tribe for a particular time, and even in Britain. They were indentured servants who had committed crimes and were only in servitude for a period of time. Just the term slavery doesn't really sit right with me in terms of
It wasn't based on race. It's based on other factors. That's the distinction.
And we made it here in the British colonies here, we made it that it wasn't just this one person was enslaved, but it went down generation upon generation upon generation, where most of the prior incidences of slavery was like you said, it was punishment for something. And so you were enslaved for a period of time, or maybe for your lifetime, but not your children's lifetime and their children's lifetime forever, like it was instituted here.
I was gonna say that the word slave comes from Slav. And people are down around, I guess it's somewhere near in the Middle East. These are soldiers used to go up and kidnap these Slavs and bring them down to slave. Because a lot of in the past, when you read the Bible and read any kind of history, remote history, conquering a town, meant giving enslaving everybody a pillow. And that was every man, woman, child, roach, and a rat.
Another distinction I'd like to make is that it's kind of like we were brought here, or African Americans were brought here as a worker surplus, that we were building America. So that's why they had to make that, they had to dehumanize us to make it seem like we have to come here and work. That's all that we're useful for.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just want to make a point that from the very beginning, even when there were indentured servants, there were individuals from European countries that came as indentured servants. They would do a term of 5 to 7 years. That was typical. And then they were released and able to live and live in society. So they came here voluntarily. They fought to come here, mostly from Ireland and other countries that were having financial difficulties. But the African, even when the African came as an indentured servant, their term was usually 20 years. So at the very outset of this whole institution, there was a discrimination against people of color. That's the first point I want to make. From the very beginning, there was significant 6 years versus 20 years is significant. And you say, where did the free Black people come that I read about from New England? That's where they came from. They would come, work 20 years, and then they would earn their freedom. But they had to work 20 years versus 5 or 6 years if they were white. The second point I want to make is to yours about the breeding farms. That goes to regarding the African as an animal. They bred when the import of slavery was prohibited legally, they instituted breeding farms. And breeding farms was an atrocity that I can't even speak about. They made mothers breed with sons, fathers with sisters with brothers. They did not care. People were forced to breed like a racehorse because they said they wanted the outcome. They wanted a big tall person, they find another big tall person. And they didn't care if they were blood related, whatever the relationship was irrelevant, because they didn't regard Africans as having feelings. And that is how they would snatch a baby from their mother's arm, because they regarded the African as a feelingless person, a feelingless being, not a human being, but just a feelingless animal. And that is a distinction between American slavery and slavery all over the world and in past countries. They disregarded the African as being a human. Forcing a person to breed like an animal is an atrocity.
Yeah, it brings to mind eugenics, and I'm just dabbled into, just learned about it in my class, African American Studies class, and I was surprised to learn that the US may have been the originator, along with Britain, Germany, and Spain.
And Australia.
Yeah, so that was challenging to know.
Yes. Yeah,
That right
unfortunately,
here.
unfortunately, the Nazis learned things from us.
Absolutely.
That is scary.
As well as the rest of the world, if I could interject real briefly. Australia emulated America. They did not call their system slavery, but it was more to eugenics. It was forced relations based on race. And their model was bleaching the Black out of the indigenous people. So if you read about those stolen generations, the mothers that were indigenous women were forced to give up their child. And they raised them in orphanages, and then they put them in white homes. And if you see the indigenous people in Australia now, they did receive reparation. But if you see them, they did just what they set out to do, bleach the Black out of Australia. And that came from England, and that was emulated by the American system of eugenics, bleaching the Black, breeding people to serve a purpose. Less African people to be in the house, more African-like people in the fields. That was done purposefully. That's how our system is different than the systems of the rest of the world in previous generations. The dehumanization of the African.
I was gonna say, like, this for people to currently say that, you know, it's like slavery or any type of result of slavery does not exist currently. It's just everything that you're saying, everything that everybody is saying is so blatantly still, you know, prevalent, just in more, you know, like kind of hidden or just like, subtle ways, or, you know, very like woven into the makeup of things. I'm just thinking about the breeding, like it was so forced onto, you know, us, and it's trickled down into, like, you know, a lot of into Black cultures and like the family dynamic. That it's just all of this is so, it's just so
Mankind,
just so
that interbreeding.
Yes.
yeah, it's like, oh my gosh.
Like slaves could earn their freedom after they had 20 babies. And I'm using that number hypothetically, but there was a policy that if a female slave had X number of babies and the GD around number 20, then they could win their freedom. And
You're in the
United States, yes, if you read before the Mayflower, you know, this is one of the most documented history books on the issue of Africans in America. And I think that's true with the welfare system. You get rewarded for having more babies, rather than trying to provide resources to young women to raise their children in a different way, so that, you know, our communities look and act different. But I think it's the same thing. I think it's the exact same, you know, philosophy. It's analogous to telling women it's okay to have bunches of babies, you know, because people make money off of welfare and not the poor, the rich do.
And the father can't reside in the home, otherwise your family starves. You don't get assistance if he's in the home.
All right, that's all the trickle down.
Yes, sir.
I just want to answer the question number 3 because I thought.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to move on to David Walker, I think.
I think it's clear that his appeal was pretty strongly worded. He, really, his appeal was really strongly worded, and he thought that it was just so bad and so wrong that, I think that blacks and free blacks or slaves were related to what he said, to his appeal. And of course, the slave owner was serious property revenue. So anyway, that's my answer.
Shelley it looks like Shelley has a comment too, online.
Yeah, I think just going right on top of what the speaker who just spoke said about David Walker really trying to do his utmost to avoid all this. I mean, I also think, Professor Getz said at the beginning that he seemed like, he was considered pretty radical and all of this, and he had this very, strong voice and all of this. But one of the things about David Walker's appeal, as far as making it absolutely clear just how legitimate he was, is he drew it up in articles. I mean, he was speaking to me like the voice of a politician. I mean that in a good way. I mean that he understood this. He had a very, as well as Equiano, who had created this sort of autobiographical legitimacy, and the which unfortunately it shouldn't have had to be done, but it was. It had to be done in the mind of white people, that there's had to be this legitimacy. But I think with David Walker, he's like, I'm coming at you on your own terms, in your own rhetorical way, and I'm calling out your hypocrisy. And he, in all the sensitive spots, he was not afraid. And I can't help but think about Harriet Beecher. So a couple of people brought up the fact that, he raised points about Christian hypocrisy, for example, just how terrible it was for us as a Christian nation to be doing the worst form of slavery, the by far worst form of slavery that the world had been able to conceive of, this sort of totalizing form of slavery that we had never seen before. But he did it as this, he did it unlike Harriet Beecher Stowe, who did it through trying to influence people through these stories. He did it, I mean, if as I will dare say, he did it as a man. He did it as a man from a political sort of point of view. And I think that the sophistication of his rhetoric can't be lost in this, even though it's sad to me that people buried him whatever means they could by trying to ignore him or poison him or whatever happened. He had something to say, and he was not afraid to get right in on the same terms of anybody else to say it.
Yep.
All right, thank you. John, where are we at on our questions? It's 8:00 now, so we need to, we got about another 15, 20 minutes at the most.
Anything else, anybody, well, go ahead, number 4.
So the fourth question asks, why do you think Walker's appeal was so threatening to slaveholders? And we kind of transitioned through question 3, just so everyone is on track with where we are. But just some insight on why we feel Walker's appeal was so threatening to slaveholders.
Go ahead.
I think everything is about finance. It's about the money. And it's either religion, the most divisive time is Sunday. We ask the question, where is God on Sunday and all of this? And you have all the segregation. And that's just what I feel. It's all about money and power. And that's what rules the world, even to this day.
Yeah.
So with the appeal, it's like he's educating Black people as well. And so an educated Black man is seen as a threat to the white man.
Yeah.
Especially when they were enslaved or even during segregation, because we can rise up if we're educated, if we know what's going on. And we can speak about what's going on, and read about what's going on. Exactly.
And if people start thinking, hey, this isn't quite what it's up, what it's supposed to be. This is not how things should be. And you look around and they're outnumbered, it's gonna make a lot of folks nervous. And I think that is playing out today as people see the demographics of this country changing. I think it's still playing out today.
Definitely.
That people are afraid, like, oh, we're not gonna be a majority in like.
Exactly.
And maybe already now, but you never know from the census. But I think that plays into a lot of it instead of, hey, let's see how we can do this thing together. It's like, I'm afraid I'm gonna lose my power.
Politically, we're called the minority, but the Black people are called the minority, but if you actually look at it, I think that we are the majority. Maybe not America yet, but worldwide.
Yes, yes.
We're the majority, and so it's kind of like a power play, a political power play.
I think one of the things that was so threatening to the slaveholders, to the whites, was Walker's rhetoric. What he's saying, he's using the Bible.
Yep.
He's using the Bible to prove his point. And I think for a lot of the slaveholders who, as others have said before, they held themselves up as Christians, they believed the Bible, and here he is taking quotes straight out of the Bible and saying, do you believe that? If you believe that, how can you do this? And that's scary to someone who thinks they're in power, thinks they know what's going on, and look at this person who, as you're saying, many didn't look at them as look at the enslaved as Blacks, as human beings. And this person is saying, if you believe that, why are you doing this? And that's scary. That's scary.
The arguments from the Bible in favor of slavery, that slaveholders.
Right, yeah, right. He's using it against them, using their own words against them.
I also think.
He's saying that God is on the side of slaves. That's revolution.
Yeah.
I also think the slaveholders were threatened because the arguments were grounded in logic. They were not grounded in emotional, emotions and, just feelings and they were not analogous to the character that they had developed. They wanted to see the African as someone who was childlike, overly emotional, super sensitive, a little puppy almost. They still equated that African with an animal, less than human, less than mature, less than strong. But his argument didn't lend itself to an overly emotional argument. It was grounded in logic and it was grounded in research based upon the Bible. And it was grounded in a way that was undisputable. And so that is threatening to people who have a certain paradigm. They needed the African to act childish. They needed the African to support their belief so that they could justify their behavior. And this appeal dispelled that.
The belief, supporting slavery, the practice continuing slavery created a status quo, both in a lot of people's thought processes and kind of what you were saying, power, me, the slave owner, I have power, I have money, but I have a status quo. I'm a certain member in my own society. But when something or someone comes along to threaten that status quo, oh my God, you know, it puts the heebie-jeebies in everybody.
Exactly. People in power want to stay in power.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's really common sense of human beings.
Yeah.
And so anything that threatens that power, I read a quote that said, the poorest white man will always think he's better than the richest black man. Than any black man, not the richest black man, than any black man. Yeah, and that's true. So as long as you keep the lines divided, and you're on one side, and that's the preferred side,
Yeah.
and they're on the other, and that's the enslaved side, then you're okay no matter what. You're okay. But the minute those lines get blurred, as they are now in today's society, the lines are getting blurred.
Yeah.
You know, and so that is what's threatening not just the slave holders back then, it's threatening to society today.
It is, exactly.
But wasn't it quite intentional? We just learned in class that race is a social construct. It's not the truth. It's something that was utilized to separate white is great, black is
not.
Yeah.
And then you have class, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, with the Black Panthers, they wanted to bring the poor blacks and the poor whites together and help them.
Brian Hampton,
And
the Rainbow Coalition.
exactly, and Hoover was the one that said, oh, no, we never have in the United States of America. And here we have that love and togetherness, which was coming naturally. We were able to maintain that. People had a beautiful.
What you were saying about the beginning of slavery,
The founding fathers created that
indentured servants, and they were like, and some of the poor whites were like, we're kind of getting a raw deal. They started kind of talking to each other, and so they like, we got the kibosh on this. We got to end this. So that's when then the outward manifestation of race has been what was used to segregate and separate people. You know, you're better than them. When race, like you said, has no biological
meaning. It's
Yeah.
not rooted in
Well,
the-
and that's when indentured servants went away because of what you were just saying, that.
They were all gonna get, they were thinking like, we're all gonna.
That's right,
You know,
that's right.
Well, they gave them they could now be overseers.
Right.
And
Exactly.
create,
Just enough.
a middle class.
Yeah.
Exactly, that created.
And that's true even after, you know, not just within the 1600s, but when they came over to Ellis Island, many of the Europeans were classified as non-whites.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's only through the years, it's through the years that they gained this reclassification
That's right.
of being white. So when she said the word social construct, it's because that the word race can be manipulated to fit anybody's definition, whoever's in power, not anybody, but the bodies that are in power.
Yeah. And somebody online here, I said this a while ago, and we kind of missed it, that even though we do not call it slavery, isn't the caste system, which is still prevalent all over the world, just a disguised form of cultural slavery?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm from
Yes, right.
Louisville, Kentucky, and there's a politician in Louisville. His name is Charles Booker. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but basically he's run for Senate a couple times, but the Democratic Party won't endorse him, so he hasn't won. Mitch McConnell keeps winning, even though we keep voting against him. But basically he wrote a book, and this is what he was doing as well, called From the Hood to the Holler, and he was going from the ghetto neighborhoods to the Appalachians.
Into the belly of the beast.
Yes,
Right?
trying to unite the poor whites and the poor blacks together, and that's why the Democrats won't endorse. Great correlation.
Yeah, that's what.
To add, even though it sounded like the conversation was also going into a integration type of vibe, but then I also feel like there was also a plan within integration as well. Once they saw that, okay, we can't, hold back, and we can't keep them separated anymore, because it's just they saw Black communities thriving, being separated, and then even recently, I'm just learning that a lot of these Black towns and places are under these rivers that people people that don't look like me are voting on. Like, how do you not feel that energy? You know,
Exactly.
like, how are you okay with, like, having your summer lake, like, you know, like, building your lake house and swimming and allowing your kids, and, but I'm riding past that and I can just feel my ancestors, you know what I mean? It's just a disconnect, it's a huge disconnect, like,
And it's kind of like they were, the poor whites, they were threatened. Their status quo was threatened. They saw the Black communities thriving. They're like, wait a minute, they're living a little bit better than us. You know, let's go burn the town. Let's go drown the town.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah.
So thinking of these parallel or these differences, do you feel like the voices of Equiano and Walker are more similar or more different? Does one speak to you more powerfully than the other? Why do you feel that way?
Well, maybe it was because I only read chapter 1 of Equiano's book. How many chapters?
There's 2.
No, I mean, in the whole
Oh, the
book,
whole
we didn't
book.
read the whole book.
No.
But Equiano, I mean, he was just, this is a cultural thing. You know, everybody worked the gardens together. The women went to war with everybody else. The men could have 2 wives. Now, Equiano stuff is just about how we lived. And Walker stuff is, oh my God, it's so much stronger and directly commenting about slavery. They're just 2 whole different ways of writing, and I liked Walker's. I mean, it's wrong to say I liked Walker's because I just kept wanting to tear the paper up when I was reading and say, this is awful, this is awful, but he wrote it so forcefully.
You can hear Walker.
Yes.
You can hear him saying it.
Yeah.
You know, whereas Equiano is kind of dry, you know, his words, what he's saying is basically the same, but Walker is in your face. He's in your face. Yeah.
I think I would use the word that they're both relevant.
Mhm.
You have to remember the time in which they were
Mhm.
living. And the purpose, that's the first thing an author does, is determine the purpose for the writing. Equiano's purpose could have been, and I think it was, to help give voice to people who didn't have roots. Remember, someone said, if you don't have roots, you don't know where you're going. You're not a strong tree. And that was his purpose. Because when he was writing, an entire generation before Walker, that was the greatest need then. You can't free people who don't know they need to be free.
Absolutely.
You just cannot. And so he was giving credence to the humanity of the enslaved African, not just to the African, but also to the enslaved. He was saying, these are human beings. These people deserve to be free, but he also had to convince the Africans that you deserve to be free. You come from great people. Many of them didn't know they
Didn't know.
They did not know that. And remember, Africa is a continent. And it wasn't just the West Coast, it was the West and Central Africa. That is enormous. Can you imagine? From Canada, maybe all the way down to Mexico. Look at the cultures and ethnicities and the neighborhoods and the differences. So he had to try to bring that group together and talk to them as well as the slaveholders. So I think that was Equiano's purpose. And Walker had a different purpose. He didn't have to give them roots because they already had it. What he had to say is, now do something with your roots. Move forward. That was his call. And it's a different form of persuasion. One is nurturing, like a young toddler. I'm going to help you learn your colors. That's what toddlers need to learn. And that's what Equiano was saying. You don't know about Africa. Not when you are 4th or 5th generation slave. Nobody's taught you about who you are. Nobody's taught you how important you are. Nobody taught you what country you came from, what religion you practice. They went through a seasoning process. The African slave was sent to a place to be seasoned. That meant they had to be stripped of their culture, purposely stripped, and taught 3 or 4 words to help them understand commands. That was who they were.
Yeah.
Mothers were not allowed to be with their babies. They would have the older disabled slave take care of 20 and 30 babies at a time.
and give them what they call the shit. Because the mother would have a baby and 2 or 3 days later, she was back out in that field. So they didn't know their culture. They weren't taught. The reason we know it is because we were taught. The reason you know who you are is not because you were born and you have an IQ of 150 or more and you're brilliant. It's because someone taught you who you are. They taught you manners. They taught you norms and how to act and how to behave. They taught you who you came from. The African was taught you are a beast of burden. And that's what Equiano was saying. No, you are not. You come from kings and queens. And Walker didn't have to do that because it was already done. Walker didn't have that responsibility. So his writing purpose was not to provide roots. It was to provide branches. And it's a difference.
It's just a difference in perspective and time.
Right.
Like there's a different perspective and it all creates a timeline. Like
And remember, he was born, Walker was born free.
Yeah.
So we can make the presumption, and I mean, I don't even think it's a stretch. If Equiano was born a slave, his life was remarkably different than a man who was born free. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. Right. His education, his lifestyle, his opportunities, his exposure. It's just like with Moses in the Bible. He was born a slave, but he was raised in royalty. And so his whole outcome is entirely different than some other young person who was born and stayed in slavery. Trust me.
And that similarity there also is Walker went back to get his people. He could have lived his life as a free black man. He could have, he didn't have to risk his life to try to free the minds of his people, and he did that. And he did it in such a cutthroat way that I think he's harder for people to swallow. He kind of wraps it in this nice, easy to swallow little package where Walker uses even his terminology of like the enemy, and he speaks directly to Black people like, y'all need to wake up, like y'all need to realize who the enemy is and stop placing them on a pedestal higher than yourself. So in some regard, he did have to teach Black people who they were and give them, some kind of power back, but he did it in a way where he wasn't appeasing to White people. He really did risk his life. And I feel like he used the enemy's weapon to bring his people in, like someone said, he used the Bible to show. The same Bible that they used to enslave Black people, he used that to try and give them their freedom or get them to understand why they should fight.
That's so similar to the comparison of MLK and Malcolm X.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's why I said the word for me is relevance. Both that relevant voices.
Right. Okay.
So this has all been very fascinating, I would have to say. But John and JeMiah, what do we need to do to wrap things up?
We had a final wrap-up question. I don't know if we have time for that, or if we just need to close it. We kind of touched on it with your comment with MLK and Malcolm X, but just I would like to close out when we think about abolitionists and just again the work that they had to do, the risk that they took to speak out against slavery. It reminds me of a quote for Angela Davis. I mean, a lot of times, so many people became complacent with where they are and they just accepted their circumstances as what they were. And Angela Davis said that I'm no longer accepting things I cannot change, but I'm changing things I cannot accept. And I just think that embodies the essence of what I think of when I think of the work of these two organizations.
I'll close with a quote from James Baldwin. I've been thinking about him a lot after seeing the Amen Corner since he shakes. And he said back in 1965, and it applies to what we're saying here. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. And it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise since it is the history that we owe our frames of reference and our identities and our aspirations. Indeed, everything has a history and it matters.
Amen.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you very much to our esteemed co-leaders, and thank you all for coming this evening. I appreciate the discussion and all of the thoughts going on, and I still have to decipher a lot of them and kind of think through some of them. But I did want to make just a couple of announcements, repeating what I said at the beginning, and that is if you have not signed up for the Paul Laurence Dunbar film that we are hosting at the library there on February 24th at 2 p.m. There'll be a viewing of the film and a discussion afterwards with the filmmaker, who is a professor at Ohio University. And then also just making a note of it that next month's discussion, which is about the Grimke family, Grimke sisters and a great niece, I believe, but the Grimkes and that will take place both online and at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in the Tavern Room. So
The co-leader will be Christine Anderson from Xavier.
okay. Excellent. All right. So again, thank you all for coming this evening. I will go ahead and close out here for us online.